I had what I believe to be a Wendigo sighting in the snowy woods of a national park. My friend, an experienced outdoorsman and survivalist, had accompanied me. We embarked on a 3-day camping trip in the midst of winter to test our skills and gear. Although not as experienced as he is, I have accompanied him on many trips and know how to react in emergencies. We set up our camp near a frozen lake. We were confident it was safe to walk on, as its deepest point was only about 2 feet. The first day passed smoothly. We built a shelter, gathered firewood, and cooked over the fire. The second day also began well, but things turned strange later that night. Around midnight, we heard a bizarre noise outside our shelter. It resembled a scream of bloody murder and lasted for about 10 seconds before stopping abruptly. Then, silence enveloped us for half an hour until the sound returned. This time, it was closer and lasted longer, about 20 seconds. We both agreed that the source of these screams was neither human nor animal. No creature could emit such sounds without succumbing to exhaustion. After debating the possible causes of these screams, we decided to investigate, armed with knives. As we stepped outside, the screaming ceased, and an eerie quietness took over. The absence of wind was odd, especially since strong gusts had been blowing all evening. We walked toward the sound's origin, and suddenly, my friend grabbed my arm and pointed behind me. Turning around slowly, I faced a tall figure covered in white fur, standing beside a tree and staring at us. It resembled a cross between a deer and a wolf, but much larger. It must have stood at least 8 feet tall, based on its height relative to the tree. Paralyzed with fear, I was pulled back into the shelter by my friend. We stayed up all night, knives at the ready, in case this thing attacked. Fortunately, it did not, and we heard no further screams. The next morning, we quickly packed our gear and left the area as fast as possible. I've been a fan of your YouTube for many years now, and I appreciate that you post accounts without sensationalizing them, which is very refreshing. I had an experience when I was only 16 in 1972, the year before my family moved to another state. It has really been bothering me ever since. My father worked as a chemist at a redacted near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He loved his job but hated the area we lived in because he felt too crowded with people and industry. One day, he came home from work quite excited about something that happened during his lunchtime walk on company property. He mentioned that there were rumors among some employees about strange sightings deep within a nearby national park. A few workers claimed they saw what appeared to be, now I kid you not, small dinosaurs moving through heavy brush near one of the trails. During his lunch break, Dad decided to take a walk along one of those paths. While hiking, he heard rustling coming from thick underbrush to his right. As he stopped and listened intently, several little dinosaur-like creatures emerged onto the path ahead. These beings seemed oblivious or unconcerned by my father's presence. They continued their slow pace across the trail and vanishing into more undergrowth on the other side. They looked like tiny versions of T-Rex, standing only 2 feet tall with short arms similar to those found on their larger relatives. His description indicated these miniature T-Rexes had feathers covering most parts of their body, except for the head and neck areas. It wasn't until after listening to later reports about encounters between humans and unknown cryptids, including ones resembling dinosaurs, that I realized my father had witnessed such an event. But there's more to the story. Several weeks before he shared this, my sister mentioned seeing large birds flying over our house in the early morning hours. She thought they might be hawks, though she wasn't sure because she couldn't see well in the darkened sky. We lived approximately 10 miles away from where Father saw those little dinosaurs. Dad didn't even believe my sister's story at the time, thinking she was just making it up. My sister and I never mentioned her sighting to him again until after he shared his experience during his lunch break. Now, his description of these things seemed identical to what my sister had seen flying over the house in the early morning. The distance between the sightings indicated these creatures traveled a great distance overnight. There were no other reports about such cryptids in the local news or any newspaper that we knew of. The rumors around this company quickly faded. I've always wondered if anyone else ever witnessed similar things in the area. I've heard of other dinosaur reports down in New Guinea and even parts of Arizona and New Mexico, but never this far north. The fact that this happened so long ago doesn't lessen its impact on me. My dad passed away several years later, but before doing so, he made us promise not to tell anyone, especially my mother, about his encounter with many T-Rexes. As far as I know, nobody outside our family heard Dad's story, until now, assuming you choose to read this. Thank you for providing an outlet to share strange encounters like this one. This has been very cathartic writing this down. I have an experience I wanted to share with what I believe was a shapeshifter sighting. This incident occurred about 5 years ago in Birch Run, located in Michigan's Thumb region, not far from where others have reported seeing the Dogman. I was familiar with the area, having spent many summers there, though I haven't visited for several years prior to this event. My wife and I decided to spend a weekend there, choosing to ride our motorcycle due to the pleasant weather forecast. We spent most of the day riding around, revisiting old spots and taking pictures with my digital camera. On our way back towards Bay City, we encountered an interesting-looking dirt road leading into the woods. It seemed like an old logging path, so we followed it, hoping to discover something interesting. Well, about a quarter-mile down, the terrain worsened. I noticed what looked like a deer lying in the brush beside us. I stopped immediately, fearing the animal might get startled by our bike and jump in front of us. The animal was about 20 feet away, and at first glance, it seemed to be sleeping as its eyes were closed. However, upon closer inspection, I realized its eyes were squinting shut. When it opened them, I saw they were not typical deer eyes. They appeared almost human-like, with full white sclera and dark, perfectly centered pupils. Another odd detail was that the deer's ears did not move at all. This was strange, as wild animals are usually very sensitive to their surroundings. Growing very suspicious, I watched the animal more closely. Suddenly, it changed shape before my eyes, transforming into a wolf or dog-like creature. This thing was neither distinctly a wolf nor a dog, but something in between. The transformation took about 3 to 4 seconds. The sighting was unsettling, and I wanted to leave immediately. I revved the engine, and we sped off down the road, engulfed by an overwhelming sense of dread that followed. At about 30 miles on this rough trail, our bike hit something hard, causing a severe jolt and nearly making me lose control. My wife asked what we had hit, but I couldn't identify it. It felt like a large rock, obscured by dust as we passed over it. Once we reached the pavement, we felt safer. We didn't discuss the incident until we stopped for gas later on. We both agreed that we might have seen a real shapeshifter. After sharing this experience with several people, many suggested it might have been a hallucination caused by exhaustion and dehydration. However, Reading other similar accounts has made me reconsider. Have you heard any similar stories, or is this unique to me? If anyone else has witnessed such events, please contact me. I need to know I'm not alone in this belief. Thank you for reading this. I would appreciate it if you can keep my identity anonymous, should you choose to post this on your YouTube. I have a few things I'd like to tell you about. The first one dates back to when I was 14, in late summer of '72. We lived in Northern Virginia at the time, and my family took a vacation to Shenandoah National Park for about a week. On our last stay, we stayed at the Skyland Lodge, located near Big Meadows. Several lodges are scattered all throughout the park, but this one sits atop a mountain ridge, offering an amazing view of the valley below. Throughout our stay, I just got this uneasy feeling, but I can never explain why. Something just didn't feel right. The day before, while hiking through these dense woods, I sensed that someone or something was watching me from behind the nearby trees. As it grew dark that evening, we all gathered around a fire pit, enjoying s'mores and conversation. Other families were doing the same further down towards another section, their voices in the air. Suddenly, everyone fell quiet as these large orange glowing balls appeared over the mountainside. They moved erratically across the sky, stopping abruptly, then floating downwards toward the tree line before quickly ascending again. They hovered for a while before vanishing. It was hard to determine the total number of lights due to the darkness and obstructing trees. Everyone was astonished by this strange phenomenon. Some speculated they might be Chinese lanterns or military flares, but most agreed there was no known explanation. That same night, as the kids slept, our parents heard odd noises from the forest. My dad decided to investigate with a flashlight. He returned looking frightened, saying he saw a large creature that jumped up and ran off into the woods. He wasn't sure if it was a bear or something else. This scared all of us. I had been having nightmares, so I slept in the same bed as my older sister. As we lay there, we heard loud footsteps outside our cabin, followed by scratching on the door. We screamed out of fear, but no one came to help. Strange sounds continued throughout the night. The next morning, we found a dead animal beside a trail near the lodge. It looked like a deer, but we couldn't be certain. At the end of our week-long vacation, someone asked how much fun I had. The truth is, I didn't have any fun due to the weird experiences we encountered. This happened 43 years ago, and I still remember everything clearly. A few years later, my parents took us back to Shenandoah National Park, but we stayed in a different location. The second incident occurred in the late summer of 2012 while driving through George Washington National Forest in the Appalachian Mountains of West Central Virginia, not far south of Winchester. My wife and I were returning home from visiting relatives in West Virginia along US Route 50 eastbound. After crossing into Virginia, we decided to take a scenic route instead of continuing on the interstate. Our trip was uneventful until dusk. First, I noticed a lack of wildlife, such as deer, turkeys, squirrels, and even birds. As we drove deeper into the forest, we saw no other vehicles. Feeling strange, we later stopped at a rest area. I noticed a couple parked nearby in their vehicle, doing who knows what. The building was empty when I went inside. My wife thought she heard voices from the nearby woods, which unnerved me even more. As darkness settled in, we began to notice strange lights appearing through the trees alongside the road. Sometimes these lights followed us for a short distance before disappearing. This continued on and off throughout the night. Finally, around 2 a.m., we arrived home, relieved to be done with the trip. The next day, We noticed several small scratches and larger gouges on the passenger door of our car. We have no idea how they got there and still can't explain them to this day. We've traveled the same route many times since then without any unusual occurrences. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this. I was on vacation in Yellowstone National Park with my family and friends. We stayed at the Lake Lodge, a hotel situated right next to Lake Yellowstone. On our first day, we decided to explore the lakeside, attracted by its beauty. During our hour-long walk along the shore, I captured something unusual in one of my photos. It showed what seemed to be a ghostly figure emerging from behind a tree, surrounded by mist or fog. Adding to the mystery, the temperature dropped significantly as we walked back towards our car. It was a strange experience. The sun was still shining, yet it felt as if a freezer door had been opened, releasing a rush of cold air. We continued our walk, encountering no one except a few bicyclists. By the time we reached the parking lot, we were all freezing and quickly turned the car's heater to full blast. Then things took an even more bizarre turn. My friend in the passenger seat suddenly asked, "Did you see him?" Confused, I asked if she was referring to the man in the red flannel shirt. She shook her head and told me that she meant the man who was dressed in black standing by the tree. My heart sank at her words. It was startling to realize I wasn't the only one who had seen these apparitions. Others had witnessed them too. At least 2 other people confirmed they saw the same figures once I shared my sighting. There was something unquestionably strange happening in the park. Could it be a haunted place with ghosts and spirits roaming around? It sounds crazy, but I can't think of any other explanation. I've had many strange experiences in my life. I've always been very sensitive to the paranormal and have had many encounters with spirits, ghosts, and other entities. I have also had many UFO sightings and have even seen Bigfoot twice. I'm writing about an experience I had in 1995 while visiting a national park in the western United States. I was on vacation with my husband, and we were camping in the park. We were staying in a tent and had been there for a few days. On this particular night, we were sitting around the campfire when we noticed a strange smell in the air. It was a very strong, pungent odor that smelled like rotten eggs or sulfur. We both commented on it and wondered where it was coming from. We looked around but didn't see anything unusual. The smell seemed to be coming from all around us, but we couldn't pinpoint the source. We decided to go to bed and try to ignore it. We crawled into our sleeping bags and zipped them up tight. We were lying there for a few minutes when we heard a loud thump on the side of our tent. It sounded like something had hit it with great force. We both jumped and looked at each other in shock. Then we heard another thump, followed by several more in quick succession. It sounded like someone was pounding on the tent with their fists. The tent was shaking violently with each blow, and we were terrified. My husband unzipped the tent and stuck his head out to see what was going on, but he didn't see anything. The pounding continued for a few more seconds and then suddenly stopped. We sat there in silence, not knowing what to do next. Then we heard a low growl coming from outside the tent. It was a deep, guttural sound that sent chills down our spines. The growl lasted for a few seconds and then stopped. We were too scared to move and just lay there, listening for any more sounds. After a few minutes, we heard what sounded like heavy footsteps walking away from the tent. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, as if whatever was making them wanted us to hear them. We listened as the footsteps faded into the distance and then stopped. We didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, we woke up and found large footprints all around our tent. The footprints were about 18 inches long and had 3 toes. They were very deep and looked like they had been made by something heavy. We also noticed that the ground around our tent was scorched in several places, as if something hot had been placed there. We packed up our things and left the park that day, never to return again. I have no idea what we encountered that night, but it was definitely not human. The smell, the pounding on the tent, the growling, and the footprints all point to something otherworldly. I have had many strange experiences, but this one stands out as easily one of the most terrifying. I hope you find this interesting enough that you would respond and shed some light on what we encountered that night in the national park. Thank you for taking the time to read this. I was in the Grand Canyon with my husband and 2 children. We were on a family vacation and decided to go hiking in the park. We had been hiking for about 3 hours when we came across a small clearing with a stream running through it. We decided to stop and rest for a bit. My husband went to get some water for the stream while I sat down on a rock with the kids. I was looking around at the trees and rocks when I noticed something strange. There was a large rock formation on the other side of the stream that looked like a face. It had 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. It was very detailed and looked like it had been carved by someone. I pointed it out to my husband, and he came over to look at it. He agreed that it looked exactly like a face and said that it was probably just a natural formation. We sat there for a few more moments, then decided to continue our hike. As we're leaving, I turned around to get one last look at the face, and that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. The eyes of the face were glowing red. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I called my husband over and he saw it too. We quickly grabbed the kids and ran back down the trail. We didn't stop until we reached the bottom of the canyon. I have no idea what that was, but the entire time after we saw it, I just got this really bad feeling. Like, I don't know if there was somebody watching us, but it just felt like we shouldn't be there. Like there was just bad energy around us. It's really hard for me to describe. And then the eyes glowing red was just the icing on the cake. I feel like there is something strange going on in that national park, and I don't think a lot of people are wanting to talk about it. My husband and I had a strange experience while visiting a national park in the U.S. We were driving through an area of the park that was densely forested with large, old trees. It was mid-afternoon on a clear day. As we drove along, my husband noticed something odd about one of the trees off to our right. He said it looked like there was someone standing behind it and thought they might be in trouble because they were leaning over at an awkward angle. I turned around to look, but all I could see were tree trunks, so I told him not to worry about it. As we continued down the road, my husband kept looking back at the tree. Now, he seemed very concerned, so I finally asked him what he saw. Hesitantly, he explained that he thinks there was somebody hiding behind the tree. Then suddenly, his eyes got really big and his face went white as a sheet, and he exclaimed, "Oh my God," and hit the gas pedal hard, causing us both to lurch forward violently. We sped away from there as fast as possible. When I asked what happened, he just kept saying how scared he was, but he wouldn't explain why until later. When we finally calmed down enough for him to talk about it without getting too upset again, this is what happened. After seeing something weird near that tree, which appeared normal for now, out of nowhere, another figure appeared to be standing next to where he originally saw someone leaning over. The new figure had bright red hair, which hung below its shoulders. It wore tattered clothing made up of mostly rags or animal skins. Its arms hung loosely by its side. The thing stood motionless, staring straight ahead. Then suddenly, its head turned toward us. My hubby described how when their eyes met, well, he felt like whatever this was somehow knew everything about him instantaneously. He also sensed malevolence coming from it, as though being scanned. At any rate, once their gazes locked, my husband felt this overwhelming urge to flee, like his life was in danger. I can't say what it was, but I believe him because of how scared he looked. It really shook him up. We never saw anything like that after this. The whole experience still gives me chills, and my husband, he doesn't like to talk about it. In fact, he refused to give me any more details when I was trying to write this down. I could tell it makes him very uncomfortable. This happened several months ago. Seeking help to understand what my girlfriend and I encountered, this has left both of us very shaken. Last September, we went camping in the Allegheny National Forest for just 2 nights. Our campsite was at Willow Bay Campground, also known as Sugar Bay. That night, we found ourselves the sole campers in the chilly, clear night. The small campground consists of 2 loops, each holding roughly 10 campers, but one loop was closed. Now, we had visited this park many times, yet this time, our electric campsite was nestled among trees, some quite close to our tent. On Saturday night, we lit a fire and stayed out until around 10 p.m. before retiring to our tent. Sometime during the night, approximately at 1:30 a.m., we were abruptly awakened by loud snapping sounds and the breaking of trees outside our tent. We heard low guttural growls accompanying these noises, suggesting the presence of something, maybe 2 creatures. In an attempt to understand better, we quietly got dressed, opened the rainfly, and lay down to listen. The sounds seemed to be made by large mammals, possibly larger given the volume of the noise. At one point, I thought I heard muffled conversation between these creatures as they moved off towards other sites, about 200 yards away. This seemed impossible, though, as any humans would have been in the path of these creatures. Trying to peer into the starless night through the foil-like stargate of our tent's front fly entrance, we crouched under this 6-inch wide, doorless, non-braced portal. Then, quite suddenly, these beings departed. Trees waved around, and small evergreens in front of our tent were pushed back by huge masses of these beings rolling trees or logs into the mix. This was followed by 4 loud, forceful strikes, and then silence. This is a gentleman living nearby who you might know, and I've considered calling him. However, my girlfriend is opposed to reaching out, preferred to keep this hidden from our children and others for now, which seems normal. But I respect your no-nonsense investigative approach, something both my family and hers appreciate in all the data. So, do you have any ideas about what we witnessed? Please, I beg you, keep our names private. Throughout my life, I've felt like I've had a host of bizarre experiences that I can't quite explain. But one in particular stands out. It occurred in 2007 while I was vacationing with my family at Acadia National Park in Maine. We spent about 4 days camping at the Blackwoods campground. Our second night, as we sat around the campfire, we heard sounds in the woods behind us. It resembled someone walking slowly through the trees, pausing occasionally before resuming. These noises unnerved me, so I decided to investigate. Venturing about 20 feet into the woods, I reached a clearing covered in pine needles. After a brief pause, where the only sound I heard was distant traffic from Route 3, I returned to the campsite. That's when something in my peripheral caught my attention. About 30 feet away, behind some trees, stood what appeared to be a large, upright canine-like creature. It was roughly 5 to 6 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur, with less hair on the head. Its face resembled that of a wolf or coyote, complete with pointed ears. It seemed to be staring directly at me, aware of my presence despite the darkness. As I stood frozen, unsure of what to do, another creature emerged from behind the trees further downhill. This second being also fixed its gaze on me, standing motionless. Feeling threatened, I decided to leave quickly but cautiously, keeping my eyes on them until they were out of sight. Then I ran back to our campsite. I chose not to share this experience with my family, fearing they might dismiss it as a figment of my imagination. However, the following day, while hiking, my sister mentioned seeing something peculiar. She described it as a large, dark brown dog or wolf with upright pointed ears, moving on two legs before dropping to all fours as it crossed our path. I'm convinced these creatures exist in some parts of North America. This is back in 2013, when me and my wife and my brother-in-law and his wife were in the state of New Mexico. They live in the town of Alamogordo, which is near the White Sands National Monument. My wife and I had never been to this area before, so we were looking forward to seeing the sights. We had been there for a few days and had already visited the White Sands Monument, which was quite impressive. My brother-in-law suggested that we visit the nearby Lincoln National Forest. He told us that there were some nice trails and a few lakes where we could picnic and fish. So, on this particular day, we packed up some food and drinks and headed out to the forest. It was about a 30-minute drive from their home. We arrived at the forest around 10 a.m. The weather was clear and sunny, with a temperature of about 75 degrees, or, if you're in Celsius, 24. We drove around for a while until we found a nice spot near one of the lakes. There were a few other people fishing along the shore, but it wasn't crowded at all. We got out our fishing gear and began to set up on a small dock that jutted out into the lake. I was excited because I hadn't fished in years. My wife was happy just to relax and enjoy the scenery around us. We were sitting on our chairs for about an hour when I noticed something strange in the sky above us. It looked like a black balloon or something similar, but it was moving slowly in one direction, then would stop for a few seconds before moving again. I pointed it out to my wife, who also thought it was strange. We watched it for about 5 minutes when it suddenly shot off into the distance at an incredible speed. It was gone within seconds. We were both amazed by what we had just witnessed. We talked about it for a while and then went back to fishing. We were sitting there for another hour or so when I noticed something moving in the trees across the lake from us. It was about 100 yards away. I couldn't make out what it was at first, but then I saw that it was a large black figure walking on two legs. It was covered in hair and was very tall. I pointed it out to my wife, who also saw it as well. We were both scared and didn't know what to do. The figure was moving slowly through the trees and seemed to be looking for something. We watched it for about 5 minutes when it suddenly stopped and turned toward us. It seemed to be sniffing the air as it had caught our scent. We were both frozen with fear and didn't move a muscle. The figure stood there for a few seconds before turning and walking away into the woods. We sat there for a while, not knowing what to do. Eventually, we packed up our gear and left. We didn't tell my brother-in-law about what we had seen because we thought he would think we were crazy. We never went back to that lake again during our visit, but we did go back to the forest a few more times before we left New Mexico. We never saw anything strange again, but we always felt like we were being watched while we were there. I don't know what we saw that day, but I believe it was some kind of Bigfoot creature. I have read about them before, and this thing fit the description perfectly. I also believe that the black balloon-like object we saw earlier was some kind of UFO or drone that was monitoring us. It's all very strange and hard to believe, but I know what I saw, and so does my wife.